There is a particular kind of story that is very hard to argue with. An old man is dying. He has kept a secret his entire working life, a secret so large it reshaped everything he believed about the world. His clearances are meaningless now. The agencies that once owned his silence can't touch him. And in his last weeks, he decides the thing he was told to take to his grave is exactly the thing he refuses to take to his grave. So he talks, on camera or to his family or into a recorder held by someone who loves him. And what he says is extraordinary. We are built to believe that man, not because of the content of what he says, but because of when he says it. A dying person, we tell ourselves, has nothing left to gain, no promotion to protect, no reputation left to guard, no reason to lie. I want to spend the next half hour taking that instinct seriously and then taking it apart, because it turns out that he told the truth on his deathbed is one of the most persuasive sentences in the English language and one of the least reliable. It carries enormous emotional weight and almost no evidentiary weight. And the gap between those two things is where a surprising amount of modern UFO mythology lives. I'm not going to tell you there are no secrets. There are. I'm going to tell you a smaller, stranger story about how the shape of a confession can make a claim feel proven when nothing about it has been tested at all. Let me start with the man whose case makes the point better than any other. His name was Boyd Bushman, and here is the first thing you need to understand, because it matters. Boyd Bushman was real, and he was not a crank off the street. He was a genuine aerospace and defense engineer with a long, documented career. When he retired in 2000, he held 28 patents in his own name. That figure is confirmed in patent records. It is not folklore. Many of those patents were assigned to Lockheed Martin. He worked across the defense industry, Hughes Aircraft, General Dynamics, Texas Instruments. Lockheed and his name attaches to serious hardware. Around the turn of the millennium, he was even the subject of an FBI counterintelligence file released years later that describes a bright, restless man frustrated by the limits his own security clearance placed on the ideas he wanted to talk about. Hold on to that, because it's the engine of the whole illusion. 28 patents, a real Lockheed career, an FBI file. This is a credentialed man. When he speaks, the credentials speak first. In October 2014, a video appeared online. It had been recorded shortly before Bushman's death that August, and it was circulated by an independent aerospace engineer named Mark Q. Patterson. In it, Bushman, elderly, matter-of-fact, holding printed photographs, says the United States government is in contact with extraterrestrials. He describes them, roughly 4.5 to 5 feet tall, 3 backbones. They communicate telepathically. They live around 200 years. They come from a planet he calls Quintumnia, and he has pictures. He holds them up to the camera. Now, watch what your mind does with that. The credentials have already spoken. 28 patents. Lockheed. Dying man. Nothing to gain. So when he holds up a photograph of an alien, the instinct is to lean in, to ask, what does the creature look like? What can we learn from the image? That is exactly the wrong question. And here is the right one. Where did that photograph come from? Because someone asked it. A Quebec news outlet, TVQC, and independent internet sleuths went looking for the being in Bushman's photo, and they found it. It was a toy, a commercially available plastic alien figure produced by a company called Halloween FX, of the kind sold in ordinary stores. The match was later confirmed by the San Antonio Express News. The dying aerospace engineer, holding up hard proof of alien contact, was holding up a novelty figure you could have bought off a shelf. A toy. Let that sit, because it's the whole lesson in one image. Every credential Bushman had, the patents, the clearance, the decades. At Lockheed, none of it did any work on the question of whether the photograph was real. His authority couldn't make the plastic anything other than plastic. The resume and the evidence were two completely separate things, and we let the first one vouch for the second. That's the trick. That's the entire trick. And here's where it gets genuinely revealing about how belief protects itself. When the toy match surfaced, you might expect it to end the discussion. It didn't. On the radio program Coast to Coast AM, a proponent named David Sereda offered a response, and I want to quote the shape of it because it's a small masterpiece of unfalsifiability. The argument was, roughly, what if the toys were manufactured on purpose by disinformation agents, precisely so that when the real photographs came out, they could be dismissed as toys? Think about what that move does. It takes the single strongest piece of evidence against the claim, the toy, and converts it into evidence for the claim. The debunking becomes part of the conspiracy. Now there is nothing, in principle, that could ever count against the story. Every disproof is just proof of how deep the cover-up goes. The skeptic Stuart Robbins, a working planetary scientist who wrote about the Bushman case for the James Randi Educational Foundation, put his finger on exactly this. Once you're in a frame where all contrary evidence was planted, and therefore itself becomes evidence for the thing it contradicts, you have left the territory of claims that can be checked. You've built a machine that runs on any input and always outputs the same answer. I'm not telling you that everyone who believed Bushman is foolish. I'm telling you the structure had become one that can't lose, and a claim that can't lose is a claim that can't be tested. Those are the same thing. So let's talk about the deathbed itself, because Robbins made a second point that's even more important than the toy, and it generalizes to every case we're going to look at. Set the photograph aside entirely. Grant, for the sake of argument, that a dying expert genuinely wants to hand you the biggest secret of the 20th century. Ask yourself, what would that actually look like if he were doing it right? If a man on his deathbed has been reverse engineering exotic propulsion, anti-gravity, faster than light, whatever the claim is, and he wants humanity to have it, then the gift is not a photograph of a creature. The gift is the physics, the equations, a diagram of how the device is built, a working model, or enough specification that someone else could build one and confirm it works. The whole value of a technical secret is that it can be handed to a stranger who can then verify it independently without trusting you at all. That's the tell. A real disclosure gives you something you can check without the confessor. A fake one gives you something you can only accept because of the confessor. Bushman held up a picture. After the picture, we knew nothing we could test. No equation, no mechanism, no way to reproduce a single claim. We had the same amount of verifiable information after the confession as before it, which is to say, none. Robbins's way of putting it was blunt. They're doing it wrong. If you truly wanted to give the world a secret, you would give the world the part it could use, and that part never, ever appears. What appears is the drama, the dying man, the held-up photo, the whispered enormity, the emotional apparatus of proof, with the proof itself missing. The emotional apparatus of proof, with the proof itself missing. Keep that phrase. We're going to need it repeatedly, because it turns out to be the load-bearing structure of almost every case in this genre. And there's one more thing worth saying plainly about the deathbed frame, because our intuition about it is just wrong. We assume a dying man has no motive, but a dying man may have several. He may want, at the very end, to be important to matter, to be remembered as the one who knew. He may be exploiting, consciously or not, the exact cultural belief we started with, that we don't question the dying. And this is uncomfortable, but it's real. The very old and very ill are not always at their sharpest. Bushman was 78. I'm not diagnosing him. No one can, from a video. I'm saying he was dying, so he had no reason to lie. Is not the airtight syllogism it feels like. It's a feeling wearing the costume of an argument. Now I want to complicate the word itself, deathbed confession. Because in the most famous Area 51 case attached to that phrase, the phrase isn't even accurate. The name is Bill Uhouse, William George Uhouse. And if you spend any time in this corner of the internet, you will see him described as a defense engineer who made a deathbed confession about working alongside a captive alien. That description is the centerpiece of a lot of content. It is also, as far as the documented record goes, false in its central detail, and I don't mean the alien part. I mean the deathbed part. Here's what's actually verifiable about Uhouse. He was a real man. Independent, records-based research has confirmed genuine U.S. Marine Corps service and confirmed that the flight simulator company he pointed to link aviation devices was a real manufacturer of real simulators. So, like Bushman, he comes preloaded with a kernel of true, checkable biography. And here's what he claimed. Beginning publicly around 1999 through the UFO investigator Bill Hamilton, and later in recorded testimony for Stephen Greer's Disclosure Project in October 2000, Uhouse said he'd been a mechanical engineer who built a flying disc simulator to train American pilots to fly a recovered anti-gravity craft. He said there was an extraterrestrial advisor. He and others called it J-Rod. His story had been drifting through UFO circles even earlier than that in a mid-1990s Area 51 newsletter under a different nickname. Now put the dates together, because this is the whole point. Uhouse made these statements publicly, on the record, in 1999, in 2000, and afterward, and Bill Uhouse died in May 2009. That is not a deathbed confession. That is a series of public interviews given 6, 9, 10 years before the man died. There is no reliable source, none that documents Uhouse delivering these claims on his deathbed or to a shocked family in his final hours. The deathbed frame was bolted on later by secondary blogs and social posts, almost certainly by contamination from genuinely deathbed-adjacent stories like Bushman's sitting one click away on the same enthusiast websites. So think about what happened here. The single most emotionally powerful feature of the story he told his family as he was dying was not something Uhouse did. It's something the story acquired, because that frame is sticky, and it travels, and it makes any claim harder to question. The confession got a deathbed the way a snowball gets bigger, by rolling. And the underlying claims? Undocumented. The independent researcher who verified Uhouse's Marine Corps service and the real simulator company was careful to note the obvious. Nobody has ever validated the actual load-bearing parts of the story. The civilian flight test career at the secret base, the S-4 assignment, the captive advisor, none of it has a paper trail. Even the dates inside his own account don't line up. He describes something like 30 years on the simulator starting in the mid-50s. Other retellings compress it to a tidy window in the 60s and 70s. The crash that supposedly produced the craft is dated to 1953, but the reverse engineering start floats between 1954 and 1966, depending on who's telling it. And the man who first researched Uhouse, the newsletter writer who found him in the 90s, eventually lost confidence in him and never vouched for the story at all. Real Marine, real simulator company, everything that matters unverified, and a deathbed that was added in post. To understand where S4 and J-Rod even come from, you have to go back to the man who started it all, and to his credit, he never claimed to be dying when he said it. In 1989, an investigative reporter named George Knapp at KLAS-TV in Las Vegas put a man on television. At first, the man was in silhouette, calling himself Dennis. Later that year, he appeared under his real name, Robert Lazar. And Knapp, I want to be fair here, is a legitimate, award-winning journalist, Peabody, Emmy, the real credentials of the trade. He treated Lazar as a serious subject. Lazar's claim was the template for everything that followed. He said he'd been hired to work at a facility called S4, built into a mountainside at Papoose Lake, about 10 to 15 miles south of the main Groom Lake base. He said there were 9 flying saucers. He said he worked on the propulsion, a gravity drive, fueled by a stable form of an element with atomic number 115. This is the origin point. Not because it was verified it wasn't, but because it put S4 and the underground saucers at Papoose story into public culture in 1989, years before anyone attached a captive alien named J-Rod to it. That timing is going to matter enormously in a moment. What happened to Lazar's claims under scrutiny? The credentials came apart first. Knapp himself couldn't verify the elite degrees Lazar claimed. The university he named has no record of him. Then the physics aged badly, in a very specific way. Element 115, now officially named moscovium, was not some secret alien substance. It was first synthesized by scientists in 2003 and announced in 2004. Its most stable known form has a half-life measured in milliseconds. It is not stable. It does not occur in nature. It bears no resemblance to the durable, usable fuel Lazar described sitting in a hangar. And the place itself? Independent Area 51 researchers, people who have spent decades photographing and mapping that landscape, report that on modern high-resolution satellite imagery, there is simply nothing at the Papoose Lake site Lazar described. No facility built into the mountain. No access road showing the bus traffic such a facility would generate. Nothing. A private pilot legally photographed the area from above and found the claimed location empty. There is, as it happens, a real Site 4 in the Nevada desert, but it's an electronic combat range roughly 70 miles away, near Tonopah, run by ordinary defense contractors. Not an alien hangar south of Groom Lake. I want to be careful and fair, because Lazar has genuine defenders, and some edges of his story did age in his favor. Rhetorically, the base is real. The secrecy is real. The CIA eventually acknowledged Area 51 exists. But none of that touches the core claim. A secret base being real does not make the saucers in it real. And the central assertion, 9, extraterrestrial craft, reverse-engineered propulsion, rests to this day on one man's testimony, delivered through one reporter, unsupported by any physical thing you can independently examine. Which brings us to the part of this story that I find most quietly damning, because the usual argument for these claims is convergence. Different witnesses, they'll say, who never met, describing the same thing, the same secret base, the same little gray advisor, the same designation. How could they all independently agree unless it were true? Let me show you why that argument fails here, specifically, because the witnesses did not independently agree. They shared a channel. After Lazar, a third figure enters, Dan Burish. Burish, originally Dan Crane, claimed in the early 2000s that he'd worked as a microbiologist at S4 and that he had personally studied a living gray alien. He gave it a name, J-Rod. He said it came from a specific star system, that they communicated telepathically, that it was all tied to a shadowy committee and a larger program. His story is richer, weirder, and more elaborate than Uhouse's. And here's the thing. He uses the same proper nouns. S4 from Lazar, 1989. J-Rod from the Uhouse material. Now, who connected them? The same man. Bill Hamilton, the UFO investigator who publicized Uhouse's J-Rod story around 1999, is also the man who videotaped Dan Burish describing his J-Rod a few years later. Hamilton even authored a document laying the two accounts side by side, explicitly presenting Uhouse's and Burish's experiences together as a matched pair, as corroboration. But that's not what a matched pair means when they came through the same hands. If I tell you a story with a character named J-Rod, and then I go find a second person who also tells me a story with a character named J-Rod, and I present the two as independent confirmation, I have not confirmed anything. I have moved my own narrative from one mouth to a second mouth. The agreement between them isn't evidence that J-Rod is real. It's evidence that both stories drank from the same well. This is the difference between corroboration and contamination, and it is the single most important distinction in this entire field. Corroboration is two people who could not have coordinated arriving at the same detail. Contamination is a detail spreading through a community that shares newsletters and interviewers and radio shows and websites. The S4 and J-rod cluster is not the first kind. It is very cleanly the second kind. The terminology was already public. The promoter was the same person. The convergence isn't a mystery to be explained. The convergence is the thing that needs explaining away, and they all read the same sources, explains it completely. Before I hand you the real history, I want to reach outside Area 51 for a moment to the most famous UFO case of all, because it shows this pattern isn't a one-off, it's a genre. Roswell, 1947. There was a real Army officer at the center of the original event, Walter Haut, the public information officer who put out the press release that started everything, the one that briefly said the Army had recovered a flying disc before the story was walked back to a weather balloon. Haut is as inside the room as a witness gets. In December 2002, Haut signed a notarized affidavit. It was to remain sealed until after his death. He died in 2005, and in 2007, the affidavit appeared in a book, and it was dramatic. It described debris, a craft, bodies. A sealed statement from the original press officer opened only after he was safely beyond questioning. It has every feature of the perfect deathbed testimony. And look at what skeptical scrutiny found. The document wasn't written by Haut. It was drafted by one of the book's authors, based on years of prior conversations, and Haut signed it. Its dramatic contents contradict what Haut himself had said in earlier, more sober accounts across the preceding decades, and by the time he signed, his faculties were reportedly failing. I'm not calling Walter Haut a liar. I'm showing you the machinery, because it's identical to Bushman's, identical to the deathbed frame welded onto Uhouse, a sealed statement, released only after death, when it can't be probed, drafted, in this case, by someone else. Its most extraordinary claims appearing at the very end, contradicting the plainer things the man said when he was younger and sharper and fully available to answer questions. The confession arrives precisely at the moment it becomes impossible to cross-examine. That's not a coincidence of these stories. In a real sense, that's the design. So if none of it holds, if the photo is a toy and the deathbed was added in post and the convergence is contamination, then what is actually there? Because I promised you at the start that there are real secrets. And there are. The truth about that stretch of Nevada desert is genuinely remarkable. It's just remarkable in an entirely terrestrial way. For decades, the U.S. government wouldn't even confirm the base existed. Then, in 2013, it did not because of a whistleblower, but because of a Freedom of Information Act request. Researchers at George Washington University's National Security Archive pried loose a CIA internal history of the U-2 and Oxcart spy plane programs, written by agency historians, and this time the Area 51 references weren't blacked out. The same archive had reviewed a version years earlier with every mention of the base redacted to nothing. The 2013 release was the first official acknowledgement that Area 51 was real, and that it began as a test site for the U-2, an aircraft that first flew in 1955. And buried in that history is one of the best-kept sane explanations for the UFO era. The CIA's own historians noted that the U-2 and its successors, flying at altitudes above 60,000 feet at a time when commercial aircraft topped out far lower, generated a flood of UFO reports. Airline pilots and air traffic controllers, seeing something impossibly high and impossibly fast catching the sun, reported exactly what they saw, something that couldn't be a normal plane. By the CIA's own accounting, these secret flights account for a large share of the UFO sightings of the late 50s and 60s. The secret was real. It just wasn't the secret anyone thought. That is the actual mechanism, and it's more interesting than the myth. A genuine classified program, doing something genuinely amazing, throws off exactly the kind of anomalies that look, from the ground, like something not of this world. The real secret manufactures the false one, and the government's own recent review says as much, in plain language. In 2024, a Pentagon office, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO, published a historical report on 80 years of U.S. involvement with UAPs. It reviewed archives, it conducted interviews, and it stated its finding directly. It found no empirical evidence that the U.S. government or any private company has ever reverse-engineered extraterrestrial technology. The programs people point to, it concluded, either never existed or were misidentified, real classified programs, or were proposals that got shut down. It described the reverse engineering belief as, in large part, the product of circular reporting, a group of people who believe it, citing each other, with no underlying evidence at the bottom of the stack. Circular reporting. That's the AARO's own term, from an official document, and it is precisely, independently, the same diagnosis we reached looking at Hamilton and Uhouse and Burrish and the shared proper nouns. A community citing itself in a circle, mistaking the size of the echo for the weight of the evidence. Now, in fairness, and this matters, that AARO report has critics. Prominent disclosure advocates argue the office was never granted access to the very compartmented programs where the real material would supposedly be hidden. I'm noting that honestly. I'm not resolving it, because I can't, and neither can they, from the outside. But notice that the objection has the same shape as the Bushman toy defense. The absence of evidence is because the evidence is being hidden from the investigators. That may be true. It may not. But it is, by construction, unfalsifiable, and we're right back where we started. There's a historian I want to give the last serious word to, because he represents the position that almost never goes viral, that the true story is enough. Peter Merlin has researched Area 51 since the 1980s. He wrote a documented history of the base built on declassified records, interviews, and hundreds of images. And his account cuts through the folklore not by mocking it, but by replacing it with something real. The U-2, the A-12 Oxcart, an aircraft that flew at 3 times the speed of sound in the early 1960s. The drone programs, the stealth prototypes that led to the F-117, the captured Soviet fighters, brought secretly to the Nevada desert so American pilots could learn to beat them. Every one of those was, in its day, as secret as any alien hangar, and far more consequential. Men did spend careers unable to tell their families what they did. Facilities were built in the desert specifically so no one could see in. The secrecy was total, and the work was astonishing, and all of it was human. That's the part the mythology can't accommodate, that a place can be genuinely, deeply secret, and hold genuinely amazing things, and none of them be extraterrestrial. So let me come back, at the end, to the old man in the dim room, because I don't want to leave you cynical. I want to leave you equipped. The dying man is not, on his deathbed, made honest. He is made unreachable. That's the actual thing that changes at the end of a life, not the truthfulness of the speaker, but our ability to check him. He can no longer be asked the follow-up question. He can no longer be handed the toy and asked to explain the toy. He can no longer be shown the contradiction with what he said 30 years earlier. The confession arrives sealed in every sense, and we mistake the seal for a signature of authenticity when it's closer to the opposite. So here is what to do with the next one, and there will be a next one. When a credentialed insider makes an extraordinary claim at the end of his life, don't ask what the creature looked like. Ask 6 colder questions. Did the confession actually happen the way the frame says it did on a deathbed, to a family, or was that frame added later by people retelling it? Uhouse's wasn't. Check. Does the claim come with anything you can test, without trusting the man an equation, a mechanism, a sample that survives a lab? Or does it come only with authority and a held-up photograph? Bushman's came with a photograph, and the photograph was a toy. If several witnesses agree, did they agree independently, or did their stories pass through the same promoter, the same book, the same shared vocabulary? Because Lazar's S4 and Uhouse's J-Rod and Burrish's J-Rod did not converge, they circulated. Where does the physical trail actually end? Follow it honestly, all the way, And notice the exact point where it goes cold, the empty patch of desert, the plastic figure, the metal sample that turns out to be an ordinary alloy. That cold spot is not a gap the story fills. It's the story's edge. And when someone tells you the evidence is missing because it's being hidden, sit with how that argument can never be wrong, and ask yourself whether a claim that can never be wrong is telling you anything at all. I can't tell you there's nothing out there. That's not the claim, and it never was. I don't know what's classified in places I'll never see, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. What I can tell you is narrower, and I think it's more useful. The feeling that a dying man must be telling the truth is one of the most powerful instincts we have. It is also, on its own, worth exactly nothing as proof. The two facts live side by side and never touch. How certain the story makes us feel, and how much of it we can actually check. The engineer held up a photograph. The room was quiet. Everyone leaned in, and the being in his hands had a barcode. That's not the end of the mystery. That's the whole of it.